When classifying remote sensing imagery, it's even more helpful to have 2, 3, or even more bands of the imagery that you're using in the classification. And this is the way that you would use those multiple bands. Let's say we have band 1 and band 2 of the remote sensing image, and this image is very small. It's just 3 by 3. It's just a 3 by 3 grid. So each one of those bands is going to have a separate brightness value associated with each pixel. And in this example here, band 1 has a value of 0 and band 2 has a value of 0 for this first pixel. So it would plot where band 1 and band 2 are both equal to 0, or this first X here. In the second pixel, band 1 has a value of 40, band 2 has a value of 128. So we would go up about 40 on here, over about 128 here, and that would be this pixel here. So we can see that each one of the combinations of a pixel from here and a pixel from here, a pixel from here, a pixel from here, is going to give us a point on this graph. We're no longer looking at a histogram, but we're looking at something called a scatter plot or a scatter graph of where each one of those pixels would lie. And those two pixels would be right on top of each other. So once we've plotted all these, what we can see is that we kind of have 3 natural clusters of these pixels that we're able to use. So I've just drawn sort of circles or ovals around all of those clusters, and I've called this cluster A, and I've called this cluster B, and I've called this cluster C. So now I can put out a new grid, and instead of having brightness values associated with one band of the electromagnetic spectrum here, now I'm just putting in an A for all the pixels that fell into this area of the scatter plot, a B for all the pixels that fell into this general area of the scatter plot, and a C for all the pixels that fell into that general area of the scatter plot. And now my map, my classified map, just has a bunch of A, B's, and C's on it. But if we actually go out on the ground and we look at those, we can actually see what they are. And maybe if we go out and we see that these are actually crops, and that the A represents alfalfa, the B represents barley, and the C represents corn. So now each one of those pixels represents a category. So if they're widely separated clusters in the frequency space, which is what we call the space when we plot 2 bands against each other, then it's easy to tell what's what. But sometimes we get what just looks like one big cluster here. And if we just get what looks like one big cluster here, we can try to break it out into different areas. Maybe we know typically where forest and pasture are, and so we try to break it into these categories here. But we might be less certain. So what other data could we add to this to become more certain of our classification? One way to do that would be add another band, because a lot of remote sensing imagery might have 7 or more different bands, different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum in which brightness values were recorded. And those additional bands could give us different information. So one way of looking at another band would be, for example, to compare band 1 to band 2, and then that same band 2 to band 3, and see what the different clusterings happen as we compare these different bands. That would be one way to do it, but it could get a little complicated comparing all those bands. And another, maybe more easy to see method to do that would be to plot all 3 of those bands in 3-dimensional space. So in this example here, they're plotting values of band 4 versus band 5, and then coming up at a perpendicular to both of those is band 6. So if we were only using band 4 and 5, these values that are A and W, they might all plot in this area on our piece of paper. And we might have a hard time breaking out those 2. But because we've added band 6, we can see that all these values of A have a much higher brightness value in band 6 than they do than all these ones in this cluster here. So by looking at that additional dimension associated with band 6, we can actually break up those 2 clusters easily and see that all 4 of these are separate classes or categories of some type of land use or similar.